Whoa. She wields the gavel. That's horseback. My goodness.
Welcome to September 28th Council Work Session. Mayor Piercy is not here today. She is at a meeting of the Regional Solution Advisory Committee with Governor Kitzhaber. That's why I'm sitting here today. Please. And I'll turn it over to City Manager.
Thank you very much. And today is part of an ongoing conversation around Envision Eugene as we sort of work through towards the end of the calendar year. We'll be having a couple more of these to keep sort of narrowing us down. Now I'll turn over to Lisa and her team to walk us through a presentation, and of course we'll be available for questions.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Council. As the City Manager just said, we're here today to carry the conversation forward on two elements of the Envision Eugene project. We're going to talk to you about housing mix, and then we're going to spend some time on industrial lands, and we're going to do two different PowerPoint presentations and give you time for discussion after both. So the last time, last several work sessions with you were spent talking about housing mix and with members of our technical resource group. We had lots of great conversations, and you heard a lot about the process and the tremendous complexity involved in looking at these issues. Today we want to summarize the collective input and analysis that we've been receiving over the last couple of years from the community resource group, the technical resource group, from our consultants and staff, and then other stakeholder input that we've been getting excuse me, as we move towards developing a staff recommendation on housing mix. So we have a PowerPoint to walk you through. We'll then have a chance to have some discussion, answer questions, and then, as I said, we'll move on to industrial. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Heather.
Great. Good afternoon. So I am going to walk through the housing part of our presentation today. I'll be talking briefly about where we're at in the Envision Eugene process, what factors go into deciding what we should plan for our future housing mix to be, what direction we think that those factors are guiding us towards, and then I'll turn it back over to Lisa for next steps before we go to question and answer. So briefly, you've seen this before. We're in the strategy refinement part of the process. We're finalizing our land needs for all the different types of uses that we need land for, and today we're focusing on our residential land need. We're also refining our strategies that will help guide how we're going to accommodate our growth for the next 20 years. And how we accommodate that growth is guided by the 7 pillars of the Envision Eugene draft proposal. They're listed up there. I'm not going to go through those, but those really are guiding all of the work we're doing, including the work on housing mix. So we've all heard this before, but I'm going to go through it a little bit again. What is housing mix? When we're talking about housing mix, you can break it down in a number of different ways, but we've really simplified the discussion to be talking about how much, when you're planning for housing for the future, how much do you plan to be projected to be built as single family versus multifamily. And we're talking about single family. We're really talking about detached housing types that aren't attached to another housing unit. So your typical single family detached home on its own lot, manufactured dwellings, secondary or accessory dwelling units, those are all detached single family housing types. For multifamily, we've kind of lumped everything else that's an attached housing type into that category. So housing that has multiple units attached to each other. So anything from a duplex, like you see in the top right-hand corner, to a fourplex, garden apartments, and to higher densities like apartment complexes and condominiums. And so what we're talking about today is what should we plan for the mix of our new housing in the future, what should we plan for that to be built as? What the pie is showing is what our existing housing mix is for our existing stock. It's 61% single family, 39% multifamily. And housing mix is an important element of our overall housing need. Specifically for single family, once we know what mix we're planning for, we'll know how many single family detached homes we're planning for in the future. And then we can start looking at, and we're doing that now, we're looking at how much capacity we have inside the urban growth boundary to fit those single-family dwellings inside the existing urban growth boundary. We're looking at 4 different types of land uses or land categories that we've identified. How many of those projected homes can fit on vacant land? How many can fit on our partially vacant land? Otherwise, land that has maybe a house on it but has room for further land division. What types of land use efficiency strategies can we do? Changes to our code or new programs that would allow us to get more single-family housing inside the urban growth boundary than we see historically. And then finally, land redesignation. Are there areas that we've planned for a type of use that hasn't developed yet, and we might consider redesignating it to single family? So it's land inside the urban growth boundary that is proposed for something else, but we might think about redesignating it to actually develop as single family, and that would reduce whatever our leftover need is. And anything that is left over that we can't fit inside the urban growth boundary is what we would need to expand the urban growth boundary for. So how do we decide on what to plan our housing mix for the next 20 years? There's a lot of information out there. We're going to walk through some of the highlights in these categories, but we can look at reports and statistics, including our local census, our local permit data, development data. We can also look at national reports. We can look at to the state and see what guidance they provide, what are statewide trends, what state planning laws say, what's feedback from state regulators. We can also look at the local committee work that's already been done. There's been a lot of committee work on this topic. And then we can, again, go back to the pillars, the Envision Eugene pillars, and look for consistency there. As we walk through the rest of this presentation, some things to keep in mind are that we haven't found a formula that tells us what exactly the future housing mix should be. So we have to take all of these things into consideration. And we also know that we're trying to plan for the future. We don't really know what people are going to build in the future. So we have to be flexible. And that's where, the 7th pillar comes in, adaptable, flexible implementation. We can monitor whatever mix we assume and adjust accordingly if necessary. So talking about what we find in reports and statistics, there's a lot of information about household demographics and trends. What we know is that household size, household age, and household income have the biggest influence on what types of housing people will choose to buy and what type they live in now. So when we look at Eugene, we see that Eugene, as far as household size goes, has smaller household size than the state average. We look at some of those reasons. We have an older, our households are getting older. We also know that the number of households with children has reduced, has shrunk. But on the other end, we've also seen an increase in households that are just single-person households. So those all contribute to that. As far as age, we can see that Eugene, understandably, has more college-age people. And we also know that Eugene and Lane County both, that the baby boomers are the fastest growing segment of our population. There's a lot of reports and studies out there nationally that talk about how those two segments of our population, how their housing choices might change, how those national studies would affect Eugene, national trends, how they'll play out in Eugene. So we can look at those segments of our population and see for college-age people, we look at people that are 25 to 34 years old. We see that they typically have less income than other age segments of our community, and they mostly rent, and they're mostly renting multifamily housing. For people that are 45 to 74 years old, that segment of our community generally has more income. They generally own the housing they live in, and typically that is single-family detached. And then what we see, and when we're thinking about the baby boomers and planning for 20 years, what we see is that there is a shift that happens around 65 and 75 respectively, where income and home ownership go down. And so, again, there's a lot of other statistics and information we could put up here. But I think what's important about these is to see that there's a number of these that might push you to assume project more demand for more multifamily housing. And then there's some of these that would push you to say, well, actually, I think there might be more demand for more single family. So there's a lot of things you can draw from there. We also look at housing affordability. What is our current housing stock, and how has it been providing housing for all segments of our community? For renters, we know that 58% of Eugene renters are cost burden. And an even more staggering statistic is that 30% of all renters are paying more than 50% of their income on housing. Cost burden means you're paying more than the recommended amount. If you're paying, which is 30%, if you're paying 50% or more, you're actually considered severely cost burden. With homeowners in Eugene, it's 33% of Eugene homeowners are cost burden. Both of those statistics are higher than the Oregon average, as well as higher than the national average. Part of that is because our demographics include a significant student population. Part of that is also the next statistic, which is that home costs have doubled in Eugene in the past 10 years compared to income. And on average, we have a higher housing cost than the national average, and we have a lower income level than the national average. So it's not just a housing stock issue, it's also an income issue, and I think that's an important point to point out. In our analysis of our housing stock, and you've heard this before, we also know that we have a significant deficit of housing that is affordable to low-income households. And we've even not been providing enough housing for median income levels that's affordable to median income levels. And when we look at the type of housing that those different segments of our community live in, we see that multifamily housing has historically accommodated more lower income households than single family housing. So then we can kind of transition to what's going on with the state. We've talked to the state regulators. They have indicated that based on the information, planning for more multifamily housing is supportable in Eugene. And when you look at the statewide planning goals framework, the greenhouse gas regulations that are going on right now, and the transportation planning that's going on right now, what you see is guidance for compact development, using less land, reducing vehicle trips, and multifamily housing or denser housing helps accomplish those goals a little bit better than single-family housing does. When we look at what other jurisdictions in the state are doing, it's not necessarily an apples-to-apples comparison, but because everybody has their own need. They are going through their same housing needs analysis that Eugene is. And so what we do see, and I'm going to orient you to this graph, is what we're seeing is that the left end of the arrow is where folks are starting out. That's where their housing mix is right now. And the direction the arrow is pointing, which all of those are pointing to the right, they're all planning for more multifamily housing, so going in that direction than what their current housing mix is. And then when you talk about, or when you look at what local work has been done, what the local committee work that has been done on this issue has resulted in, you see that we've been working with consultants, Echo Northwest. They came up with the recommendation of moving towards more multifamily housing in the future, and that would be at a 55-45 mix. The Housing Mix Subcommittee, which is a subcommittee of the Community Resource Group, looked and had several meetings on this issue. They came up with a range that our new housing should be planned for somewhere between 60-40 and 55-45. Technical Resource Group, as you know, has looked at this issue. You've seen their matrix before that really bookends the discussion of the range being at 60-40 and then flipping to 40-60. And then most recently, the Planning Commission has discussed this as well. Their range that they, and their letter is in your packet, they're at about 60-40 to 50-50. And what those dots represent is kind of a straw poll that the Planning Commission did for individual commissioners. And so they landed with about 4 commissioners at 60-40 and 3 of them at 55-45. And then what you see at the bottom there is the Sustainability Commission has looked at this issue, as well as the Housing Policy Board. Their letters are in your packet. Both of them recommended that based on demand and the affordability issue, that they recommend planning for more multifamily housing in the future. They didn't come up with a specific range or mix. The Sustainability Commission noted that they thought the new housing mix should be closer to 40-60. The Housing Policy Board didn't indicate either way. And then you can go back to kind of our foundation document, the 7 pillars of Envision Eugene. And what our analysis has, in looking at the intent of these pillars and the community vision that we heard when putting these pillars together, was that planning for more multifamily housing would fit with these pillars as a package. And I'm going to talk specifically about 2 of these pillars because I think that they're the most relevant. That's the affordable housing pillar and the compact development and transportation pillar. So as we discussed earlier, we know we have an affordable housing or housing affordability issue in Eugene. The pillars already talk about planning for more affordable housing, but how much? What we know is the majority of people, and this is another statistic, but the majority of people in Eugene that make less than 80% of the median family income typically rent, and they're typically cost burden. So again, the lower income levels and our workforce housing, they're typically renting, they're typically cost burden, and the majority of them are living in multifamily housing. Multifamily housing has been, the higher densities have been accommodating that segment of our community more than single family has. There's been a lot of discussion about whether or not actually bringing new multifamily housing into the market actually helps provide more housing for this segment of our community. Is it really more affordable? We believe that it is reasonable to assume that building multifamily housing types can be built at a more affordable cost and be more affordable to that segment of our community than single-family detached can be built. And it's significant to think about what we're planning for. We're not just planning for today, we're planning for 20 years. So bringing new multifamily housing or denser housing onto the market now really sets up our affordable housing stock for the future, because the analysis that we've done shows that typically older housing stock is more affordable than newer housing stock. And so what you're doing is you're kind of setting up, you're building up your affordable housing stock for the next 20 years. our housing stock has maintained at about an average of 60-40 for the past 20 years. And we know we have a significant deficit in affordable housing for these segments of our community. So it's pretty clear that something needs to change, and it's not just mix, but that is one tool to help us get there. There are a number of other things we need to look at as well, a number of other programs. But we know that under the current mix, we have continued to be deficient in housing for certain segments of our community. And as far as compact development and transportation goes, the discussion under this pillar is really a vision of investing and densifying, continuing to densify downtown and some of our key transit corridors. This helps us also use less land, and multifamily housing and denser housing types is how I try to think of it as well, really help accomplish those goals, help us move closer in the direction of that vision. And so what we've just talked about is our analysis is showing that it appears we need to plan for more multifamily housing or denser housing than we've seen in the past for the future. But how much more? How much of a shift do we plan for? We know that we don't know what the market and economic conditions are exactly going to be like in the future. So that's true. It's something that's kind of out of our control. And then we also know that we're not requiring people to build multifamily housing. We're really creating more opportunities for multifamily housing or more affordable housing to occur. And then finally, we also need to demonstrate to the state that this meets their that whatever mix we're planning for meets their requirements and that it's achievable. And we also need to demonstrate this to the community. So based on all of those factors we've talked about, we feel that the factors are guiding us towards something like a 55-45 mix. If you look at how that mix compares to the local work that's been done on this topic, it falls right within the ranges of the Housing Mix Subcommittee, the Technical Resource Group, both groups that are subgroups of the Community Resource Group. It falls within the range of the Planning Commission, and again, Sustainability Commission, the Housing Policy Board, both of them in general were recommending more multifamily housing. And then it is actually the same mix that our consultants who have done the statistical analysis recommended. And then looking at state trends, how would a 55-45 mix for new housing compare to what the other jurisdictions are doing? Well, it's right in there. It's comparable to some of the shifts that we're seeing being planned for throughout the state. You can see our sister city, Springfield, is planning for a little bit more multifamily housing than a 55-45 mix would be. And then what does that mean on the ground? So we're projecting about 15,000 new homes for the next 20 years. At a 55-45 mix, that means we'd be planning for about 8,200 single-family homes and about 6,700 multifamily homes. Planning for this would shift the mix of new housing by about 6% from what we've historically seen. So about 6% of new housing would be planned in addition to multifamily housing than what we've seen in the past. What that means for our overall housing mix is that it actually only shifts the overall housing mix, so existing plus new, by year 20 by about 1%. And so I think the point here is that it's a significant direction shift for new housing. And what it does with our overall housing stock is it helps level off or not increase the deficit of housing that we're not providing for those population segments that we have a deficit for, so for those lower income levels. And so I'm going to pass it off to Lisa at this point.
Thanks, Heather. Just a few points that Heather mentioned that I really want to emphasize for you. One is just noting that our housing mix has basically been the same for the last 20 years, and that, as you've heard, it's not meeting the needs of a large portion of our community in terms of affordability. We have a significant affordability gap. You heard about that 50% of renters are cost burdened, and of that segment, 30% are actually severely cost burdened or significantly cost burdened, meaning that they're spending 50% or more of their income. And having heard that our incomes are lower than the national average and our housing costs are higher, that's a significant factor for us in terms of considering this information. And in considering that, we really anticipate that our housing gap is going to continue and may even widen given these trends over the next 20 years. And so that's something that factored into our analysis. We have a responsibility to the state in demonstrating how we're going to address this affordability gap. We also, in looking at the pillars that Heather sort of reminded you of or walked through quickly, moving towards those pillars, really trying to balance this overall need and trying to hit affordability. Even if it's just incrementally, we have to look at we have to address that if we're going to be consistent with our pillars. We think that what we're putting together in terms of moving towards a recommendation is reasonable in that the overall shift is 1% of our total housing mix. So it's moving us from a 61% overall housing mix to a 60% housing mix. While that may nudge our development patterns towards more dense, it's not something that we're going to be feeling in our existing neighborhoods. It's not even going to be necessarily perceptible in new single-family neighborhoods in terms of overall densities because it's such a minor overall adjustment. It could be argued that a more aggressive approach should be taken, given these factors, that we should be looking at a higher multifamily percentage moving forward. At this point, we don't think that a more substantial shift is necessarily reasonable within the market, and given those unknowns, taking a more incremental approach, giving ourselves the opportunity to revisit as part of our pillar number 7, monitoring and then finding out if we need to adjust our policies. I think this sets us up for a fairly reasonable strategy. So what will be important will be having policies and strategies that remove the barriers that Heather talked about in multifamily, and also creating more incentives so that we can see where the market's going to go with that. Just a couple other things. We've been talking with the community for well over a year about these issues. We've heard lots of opinions. We've talked to lots of different people. That's been incorporated into our analysis and our thinking. We do think this is, based on all of that, we think this really is a reasonable approach, and so moving towards landing on a recommendation in this area. Just a couple of next steps that I want to highlight for you in terms of our single-family work. We are going to begin contacting property owners similar to what we've done for the industrial lands. Even if we have a need of 1 acre of expansion, it's our responsibility to start talking to people, giving them early information and notification about this potential, and just really getting them involved in the process. I think it's a good opportunity for us to do that. The state really governs what the process is, and they will require us to start looking at lands that already allow a certain amount of development, as opposed to looking at prime farmland with no existing designation for residential. We, at this time, we're going to be contacting property owners whose land already has a county land designation allowing a degree of development, either rural residential, rural commercial, or rural industrial, and that we anticipate coming back to you in November with more information on this. Just a couple of overall next steps, that we are starting to prepare recommendations for the overall urban growth boundary package, and we'll talk a little bit more about this after Jason's presentation. There's lots of outreach opportunities coming to us this fall that we'll be engaging in this fall with the public. So at this point, we're available for questions and discussion, and then at that conclusion of this section, we'll go to the industrial land conversation.
And how much time do you need us to save for the industrial?
Well, it's really at your pleasure, but I think if we have 30 minutes, we're in good shape for industrial.
Give us only half an hour.
Well, as I said, it's at your pleasure. We could do it in 15. Jason's good.
Okay, we'll see what happens. I have on the list. On the list, I
think he's done it in 6.
So far. So Mike, you're first.
Thank you, Betty. Please put me down for a second round. I have 5 questions. First one, you mentioned that the current housing mix, you said the housing mix is 6139. Don't I remember that accurately, that that was a measurement of like 01 to 07 or 01 to 08?
You're right. It was 2007. It is also the mix of our current 2011 mix. So what we used in ECLA as a baseline was the 2007 mix, which was 7139.
I found that interesting because I saw a presentation where that was really a boom time in housing being built. And if you include the last few years where the economy, like it is now, has changed, you get something closer to 68%. And I was wondering why you didn't bring it more current with those figures. Is it just because we did the analysis so far long ago with ECLA?
ECLA, and Jason, jump in if you feel that you need to. ECLA looked at that exact issue because technically the state requirements would have required us to look at 2001 through 2008 and take the average, which, yes, I think it was like 69% single family. The ECLA technical committee at that time was trying to address the boom years and went with the 2007 housing mix as a baseline instead of the average of from 01 to 08. Part of that's because that had been on roughly the average over 20 years has been about 60-40.
Well, I would think that we want to look at the economy the way it is, and one of the things I would wonder too is, and permeating all five of my questions, is the issue of, you did a wonderful job, by the way, of all the work, and especially the analysis of comparative communities, like with Medford and Salem and Albany and so forth. But I'm much more concerned with the relatively close-in impact communities of Veneta, Elmira, Junction City, Coburg, and sort of thing. So I would want to look at their comparative analysis as well to say, is the impact of our decisions to create a much higher percentage of single-family housing in those close-in outlying areas, because that's where people want to go. And it leads directly to my third question I'll get to in a minute, but I'll try and take them in order. Second, housing mix. How do we decide on a mix, was that sixth slide. I don't see in there anywhere that we do an analysis based on economic impact for this area. I was wondering why. And the reason is because obviously we're not going to get back to the boom times of building single-family homes in the same way. But I would think that the amount of single-family homes, or the mix we decide on, certainly has a profound effect on the number of jobs in our local economy. And I would hope that's at least some part of the mix and the consideration. The third question is around the idea of the demographic mix that you were talking about, and that's kind of what I was saying before. You measured what we're seeing in Eugene, which is a higher percentage of boomers and a lower percentage of families. But did we measure Coburg and Elmira and Veneta and Creswell and see if they're skyrocketing with single families because of our decisions here is having an impact on them? Did we measure that?
We did not. We're required to plan specifically for Eugene and not necessarily take into account what's going on the other.
And here's my point, is that I agree with you 100% that we need more affordable housing in Eugene. The facts are very clear that we do. Let's not be, But the biggest single cost of building any type of housing is land. And so if we're going to build more affordable housing, having less expensive land, which is done by virtue of having a surplus of land rather than a very small amount of land for building, drives the effect on that cost. I only have 5 seconds left, and I'll do the rest in the next round. Thank you.
Before I call on Pat, is Alan there?
You there, Alan?
Do you want to be in the queue, Alan? Not right now, but you want to be in, okay. And Pat, you're next.
Thank you, Dr. Taylor. I applaud the fact that you're shooting for the 55-45, even though that is at the low end of what the Planning Commission is recommending, and that it is a minority of the Planning Commission that recommends that low of a mix. The Planning Commission, the majority, is looking for a 60-40 mix, which still is less than what we have now. Is that correct? We're 61-39 now?
By 1%, yeah.
but less. Yeah. I thank you for the questions that you raised. I'm looking forward to hearing the answers. So I won't ask the same questions. I'm a little bit more concerned about the cost of housing in Eugene and Springfield. A few years ago, when I was last on the council, it came up that Eugene had the second highest cost of housing when based upon the housing cost and the median income of Eugenians, second in the nation only to San Francisco. I think that's changed a bit now, but still we're roughly comparable to San Francisco in terms of how much it costs somebody to live in Eugene based upon how much they're earning. And I need to comment a little bit more about what you'd said, Heather, about aging our houses to make them more affordable rather than making more houses available.
And I was specifically talking about the analysis that was done on our housing stock that is older versus newer. And what we looked at was, or what Echo Northwest pulled for us during the ECLA document, or during the ECLA review, was that older housing stock, specifically multifamily, rented for less than newer housing did. And so that was the connection I was trying to talk about, was that even though it's new when you build it in the first 5 years or 10 years, we're planning for 20 years, and at some point, newer housing stock comes on in place of what you just built in 2012, and in 20 years, that's 20 years older, and so in theory, what we've been seeing is that as housing stock ages, it actually becomes more affordable compared to the newer stuff that's on the market.
That is assuming that income is rising at the same rate as the cost of the new housing that's being developed, which makes the older housing seem more affordable.
And I think, if I'm not mistaken, there's a dynamic where, for somebody, that new housing is affordable because there's a whole range of incomes. And so somebody rents that, vacates other older stock, which then becomes available and is more affordable and accessible. So I think it's like this ladder principle that happens. Just one other point that you raised, just to address, it really is about this combination between housing and economic opportunities. And so Heather touched on this, but there's a reason why we have 7 pillars in our document, that we really are focusing on a number of strategies and goals. So while we may have even if we had a lot more land for single-family and multifamily, the market, the demand, is, we've been reading the Register Guard articles and other articles recently, there's a surplus of land, there's a surplus of development lots that aren't being built right now, and people having burdens with taxes and things like that. So in the short term, what we need to really focus on probably are those jobs, and then in the long term, we'll have more demand for more housing. So we have a little bit of an opportunity, I think, to focus on those other strategies.
Great words. Thank you for saying that, Lisa. And I think in the short term and the long term and every term, we have to focus on jobs. That has to be an ongoing issue. But in the meantime, there are reasons other than having new houses that make Eugene more expensive, and not just in comparison, but more expensive than other communities in Oregon as far as the actual cost of housing. And as we move forward, we need to consider the fact that just aging our housing stock isn't necessarily the best way to make it more affordable. And also, we talk a lot about, Councillor Pryor, you've spent quite a bit of time listening to entry-level and low-income housing being built in different parts of the community. We have to focus on that at all times, making certain that we are bringing in housing that's affordable to even the lowest incomes, even the people who are least able to afford housing. But it's important that we look at all of the facets of what makes housing expensive in Eugene, and also while bearing in mind, where do people want to live? Would they rather live in single-family or multifamily? Make certain that that's in the mix as we discuss this, at the same time that we are keeping our eye on the economy and making certain we're attracting jobs to the area. So I just wanted to point out that aging stock isn't necessarily the best way, in my mind, of making housing more affordable. Making more affordable housing, making housing more affordable to create is the best way to do it. Thank you.
Next is George Brown.
Thank you, Betty. I just have a couple questions. In the AIS on the second page, page 112, it says here about the baby boomers for 46 to 65 now. And in 10 years, that upper range they'll be 75 years old, and it goes a little bit farther down. It says at age 75, home ownership rates begin to decrease. So it seems like in 10 years from now, there'll be a fairly significant turnover. A lot of those people will be wanting to move to an apartment or a condominium or downsize. So that'll free up who knows how many homes. I'm just curious, do we know how many homeowners or the number of homes in that age group of the prime baby boomer rate? Because I think it's going to be pretty significant turnover there of housing stock that will become available in 10 years.
I think we do. I can see if I can put my fingers on
I don't
it before
need
we...
to have it right now,
Okay.
of course, but I was just curious. I
Sure.
would like to see that, just
Okay.
out of curiosity. And I have another question. Since I've been on the council for a little over 2.5 years, and almost the only low-income, affordable housing that's been built, multifamily, has been subsidized one way or another. And I'm just wondering, is that just how it is? Is it always going to have to be subsidized? Will a builder or developer ever go, hey, I'm going to build a low-income housing project, and I'm not going to ask for a 10-year tax exemption? Or so and the MUPTs that the council granted in the university district were always part of the packet was financial, of like, this is what the project would look like with the MUPT. This is why we want it, because it'll work with it. And then it won't work without it. And then there was that sheet, too, that showed I'm just wondering if we, at some point in the future, not today, if we could have a brief explanation that help us understand better why there is such a lack of affordable housing, of like the kind of a MUPT-like comparison there. And I'm just curious, does it mean, this is just a rhetorical question, I guess, does it mean that low-income and affordable housing will always be subsidized? That may be. But I'm just curious. Because there's an enormous lack. We all know that. The waiting lists for these places are miles long, and so maybe that's just the way it has to be. So that would be nice if we could have a brief presentation to help. It would certainly help me better understand this segment of the housing discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. There's a lot of aspects to this, and that's what makes this an incredibly complex issue. One, you're trying to predict the future, and we all have a different vision of what we think the future is going to be, and we all know the future ain't what it used to be. And the other part is what I've called for the last 5 years the whack-a-mole aspect, where if you try to resolve one area, it pops up somewhere else, and you try to push that one down, it pops up somewhere else. And it seems really the only effective way to defeat the whack-a-mole is to not try to focus on just one aspect, but to try to balance coming down on all of the places where it can pop up at the same time. For me, that means you then have to balance all of the different factors: demographics, markets, livability, neighborhoods, available land. And that's really, to me, the crux of what we're trying to do here is find the right balance. And when we talk about 55 versus 45, and I agree, I think that would, for me at this point, I couldn't even see going below that. I mean, we could debate between there, but I think 55 would be the lowest I could talk about, trying to predict what the future might be. But for me, the factor I wanted to focus on right now was the notion of we're having a lot of conversations about neighborhood livability. And there is a huge amount of concern in the community that as we work toward whatever kind of balance of housing that we want to have in our community, the impact that has not just on the urban growth boundary and the peripheral, but the impact that has even within our community in neighborhoods where people are nervous that does that desire for an increased density or housing mix have an impact on our already existing neighborhoods? And I can think of 3 or 4 neighborhoods where that is a major and significant issue for them. And so I don't want to sacrifice A in order to achieve B any more than I want to sacrifice B in order to preserve A. Once again, I think we need to come down in a balanced way on all of those openings so that we don't just wind up sending the mold to a different opening and then we have to suffer with it there. That's why I'm glad we didn't try to rush this just because of the fact that we had to meet a state law. I think it was better to take our time and do this properly, and I still don't think we're completely there yet, but I appreciate where we've gone so far, and I think we're working in a very deliberate way. And I appreciate the way you're coming back to us on a regular basis to kind of present where we are. But I want to convey to you that I still have a lot of interest that there's a lot of different holes where this mold can pop back up again, and neighborhood livability is simply one of them. The mix is another one of them. The need, and I'm not advocating for sprawl in any way, shape, or form, but I'm also not saying that I don't want to sacrifice neighborhoods at the expense of not looking at what we realistically need to do with our boundaries. Once again, it's a balanced approach, and I guess of all the words I could use, balance is probably the one I'm advocating for the most.
Everyone's using every second of their time today. Next, Alan, you're next, if you're there.
Thank you. First of all, it was an excellent presentation. And well done. And I think you came to a reasonable conclusion. I'd be impressed with you. And all of the indicators indicate we do need more multi-family housing. Very, very difficult to argue for the status quo percentage. And I think around 55 is probably a good place to be, given all the demographics, all the evidence we've heard, and all the indicators. And as to housing affordability, I think that's why we have a 20-year supply of land for residential, is to ensure that the land prices stay reasonable, but it also doesn't account for the fact that we are an expensive housing city. And that makes me re-emphasize and want to bolster our affordable housing programs and make sure that those types of affordable housing projects that we can build help people at the low end of the income scale be able to get into quality housing. So I think 55, 45 is a good place to land, and I can support it. So, I'm going to leave my feelings there. There you go.
Translation.
Are you through?
He said 65, 35.
There seems to be some static there somewhere.
Boy, doesn't there.
Andrea?
Thank you. Thank you, Alan, for calling us from the Witness Protection Program. Your identity has been secured. I'm also I'm okay with the mix of 55-45. I think that this is a lot of work, and I really do appreciate the TRG and everybody that has put all their time. There's such a wealth of experts willing to volunteer and to really work at this, and I really do appreciate that. But to me, in reality, this is all. Nobody has a crystal ball. Nobody knows who's going to build what or what's going to be affordable. And I think even for multifamily housing, I think the reason it's so expensive and why they need subsidies in that area, and I've heard this a lot, is that they want a quality job, which makes sense. Not that I'm changing my mind on what I plan on doing in the future, but I just feel like I think about the ones that have been built without subsidy, which is in 6th and 7th, and those places are horrible. I mean, and they're 20 years old, granted, but I think that you get a better product with that. And I think even with our, NEDCO and all the different agencies, St. Vincent de Paul, I mean, they have some quality multifamily, and so I guess the answer would be yes, if we want quality, and if we, in certain areas, and the dispersal part of that too with land banking is one of the reasons. The dispersal policy also has the land banking connected to it, and that's why they're out in the community, which I support totally. So I'm okay with this. I think that when people go to be able to afford to buy a house, they look at a lot of things, not just the amount of money. And it's not only the quality of life, but the type of life they want to live. And if people want to live in Veneta they're going to move there whether the houses are $5,000 cheaper or higher. And so I don't know that we're sending people in that direction. I think that there's a lot that goes into purchasing a house. I know when I purchased my house, that wasn't quite the case, but I think I've talked a lot to different people, and so I'm okay with this mix, because I think it's all kind of like looking in a crystal ball. I mean, I know there's a lot of work that's gone into this, and there's a lot of trends in history that also follow this, but I think in reality, we don't know what people are going to do in the future, and so I think that this is the historical piece that kind of has led us to here, and so I'm okay with it.
Thank you. And George Polling is...
Well, I think Mike was bringing up some good points about some of the research and some of the stats and the time frames that the information was gathered, and I'm curious to see what his other two questions are going to be, as well as the responses to some of those questions that he's had. Chris brought up a good point about the neighborhood livability. It seems like when there have been discussions about building denser neighborhoods, we get an awful lot of pushback from the people that are already there. So that's another thing that we have to take into consideration, like he was saying. And I, on the other hand, Andrea talked to a number of people, and I work with a number of people out there that would like to live in Eugene but can't afford it. So they're living in Harrisburg, they're living in Virginia, they're living in Johnson City because the cost of the housing in Eugene versus the outlying areas. And I think we are creating a situation where we are causing people to move to these outlying areas, which in turn increases the number of trips per day and trips per mile, which to me is counterproductive of some of our goals as a city. So we need to take in consideration that, and also by having a larger amount of land designated for single family, if the market isn't such that the single family homes aren't being built, that land can continue to be used for its original purpose, whether it be agriculture or whatever the case may be. So I'm not sold yet on the 55-45 split. And thank goodness we're going to have public hearings and time for testimony and more information coming to us. But whatever the mix turns out to be, I hope we leave enough flexibility in that number where if the market shifts one way or the other, that we can, as a city, shift also to accommodate whatever is occurring.
Lisa.
Just to respond on the neighborhood livability, compatibility point that was raised by both of you, just reminding you that in our pillars, that's really addressed and embedded in terms of preserving the neighborhood character and not assuming a higher level of density than what we currently experience in the neighborhoods. And so our strategy around density is primarily along transit corridors, mixed-use commercial areas, and so it really does honor those values that you both have raised.
Are you through, George?
Yes.
You have seconds left over. No. Okay, I have two people down for second round, Mike and Pat. And Alan, did you want to be for a second round? Sit down. Oh, you're welcome.
He said second and third.
Mike.
Thanks, Ben. I too agree with Chris that the issue of balance and having the whack-a-mole problem is something to consider in this kind of discussion. My chief concern with that is that we're looking at it in a very narrow way. We're only looking at it as its effects on Eugene, as if Eugene were operating in a vacuum. And we're not even asking the question about the change in demographics in the outlying areas. But we know anecdotally what the truth is. How many schools closed in Eugene last year? And how many of them closed in the last several years that George had to close before he left as superintendent? And how many of the schools in the outlying areas are growing? And look at Veneta coming to us asking for more water because their projected growth is what it is. I think if you look at our 61-39 split, for the last several years, we've been saying we want to build more densely, and the market has been telling us we want to have more affordable housing that is single-family detached. And so the market is sending people where the housing is less expensive, and that's about the cost of land. So I'm wondering why it is that the answer to the obvious question of how do we get more affordable housing in Eugene is build more multifamily housing. Why is that the answer instead of what do we do to decrease the cost of land so that we're more competitive with these surrounding communities? And we're not even studying the figures to know whether or not that's an intelligent line of pursuit. And I'm kind of concerned with that because I think we're making this decision in a vacuum. I don't need to talk more. That kind of captures my overall point. But if you have any capacity to get us the demographic mixes of some of the outlying areas, the affordability of land comparison between outlying areas in Eugene, the rate at which their single-family detached versus multifamily housing was built in surrounding areas, I think that could be very instructive to our discussion about what kind of community are we likely to get with this answer as the answer to how do we create more affordable housing. Yes, I am.
You
What
left
time to spare?
38 seconds. Next is Pat.
Thank you. The one thing that I look at when we see land that has been purchased for development and the development's not going through for one reason or another, in speaking to some of those folks, the reason is the land costs too much to begin with, and so to develop it at this point in the economy, it makes the housing too expensive for people to buy. And a part of that is what Councillor Clark alludes to, is that land costs are pretty high. There's one development close to where I live in West Eugene, beautiful land, flat, easy to develop, ready to build on, but the land cost too much initially, and so the housing that would go in there is just above the level that people are going to be able to afford, particularly in that part of town. So there is a cause and effect there. The other thing I wanted to point out is that if we look at our local economy, we used to have a wood-based economy. We used to have a lot of mills around here. We don't have that anymore. One of the main industries we have in this area is home building, and building single-family dwellings drives a lot of the economic prosperity in our community. Mm-hmm. So by reducing single-family dwellings, in effect, we are reducing our ability to have the engine going on our economy. So in looking at reducing from a 61 to a 55, you're taking a chunk of what potentially is a lot of jobs in the economy, good-paying jobs that support other jobs in the community, by taking away that 6%, or suggesting that we take away that 6% of the future. So we have to throw that into the mix. And like Councillor Poling, I'm glad that we have more chance to discuss this and more opportunity to listen to public input on it. If you look at the map up there, we're talking about outlying communities getting bigger. Does anybody know where Junction City's city limit is now?
Pretty close there.
Right at Meadowview Road. I can throw a rock from Eugene city limits into Junction City limits now, and I'm not a very good thrower in particular. So, the communities are growing in. Now, we can discuss that it's not residential land that's being pushed down Highway 99 toward Eugene, but the fact is that those communities aren't opposed to the growth. They're welcome to it, and as long as the housing is less affordable there, it's going to happen. They're going to need more water, they're going to need more infrastructure, and they're going to need more West Eugene parkways or other highways to get them from where they live to where the jobs actually are, which is in Eugene. Thank you.
You reminded me of Sarah Palin throwing a rock. Next.
Sarah's got a better arm than I have.
Just throw a long way.
George Brown.
Well, thank you. I'd just like to remind everybody that the whole reason we're going through this long, drawn-out, and very expensive process is because we're told to by the state. We used to do regional planning here. We used to have one growth boundary with Springfield. We probably wouldn't be having this discussion, possibly, it's a possibility, if we still had the urban growth boundary with Springfield, because there is room there for housing, there is room there for industrial land, but we have to separate them. And so it's every man for himself now, and I think it's kind of an unfortunate step away from regional planning, personally. But, it's too late now. We have to go ahead, and we really, yes, probably there will be inexpensive housing built in Veneta. That's been happening anyway, and it's been happening in all the outlying areas already. So I assume that will accelerate a little bit, perhaps, if we have this big spurt that is predicted. So, it's that's the reason we're here is because we were forced to do this. I think unnecessarily, really. I would rather have seen the regional model, sustain itself, and I think it's a better way to plan things. But here we are, so we have to do it. We have to do it this way. I just wanted to remind people watching that that's why we're in this pickle here. Thank you.
Thank you. And I guess I got the last word. I put myself in the queue a couple of times, but I waited to let all of you talk. I have a question. This is just a rhetorical question. I wonder how Pat and Mike are going to reduce land costs.
Let's have the discussion.
Well,
You want to hear right now?
I'll give you an answer if you like.
you probably
She said it was a rhetorical.
I'm just curious. If you have a secret, I think I know what it is. I personally prefer a 40-60 mix, which I think is what the Sustainability Commission recommended. Isn't that right?
They actually didn't land on a specific mix, but they said that I believe that the letter that's in your packet indicated it would be closer to a 40-60 mix, but they didn't take a vote and recommend a specific mix.
Okay, but I think that makes more sense because we're going to run out of land, and there isn't any more being created. And I think it's really important that we save the agricultural land and the forest land just for the future of us and any other people and people who come after us. I think if we make regulations so that it will be easier to build multifamily housing, we'll probably have more, and many people do prefer it. I don't myself, but many people prefer to live in multifamily housing, get rid of the lawn care and so forth. One more thing I'd like to say is if we're concerned about affordability of housing, and if we give subsidies to firms that bring in jobs that pay low wages, we're going to keep increasing the number of people who need low-cost housing. And that's something, it's another case of where one thing affects another thing. And I think we have enough. Did anyone want another final word before we go to, no, I think we'll go ahead to Jason now.
Yes, but I won't.
Turn, Jason.
Thank you. Actually, we're going to have Lisa say a couple of words, and then I'll kick in.
Oh, okay.
So, since last time we talked about industrial lands with the council, at that time you had directed us to go out and begin contacting property owners. We've done that. Jason's going to tell you a little bit about that today. We also have reconvened a sort of reconfigured group of the subcommittee from the Community Resource Group. We invited anybody from that group. Well, we invited folks from that group to participate. We also added 2 new members, which are Mia Nelson and Sean Bowles, and that group has met a couple of times, focusing on some technical elements. We're going to begin framing the economic opportunity analysis, and then also we've created a working group that will be looking at agricultural and associated industries, because it's surfaced in that group's meeting that was an element that really was not paid maybe enough attention in the regional economic prosperity plan. So we're going to spend some time on that for our own economic analysis. So with that, I'm going to let Jason go.
Thanks. So as a reminder, and so that you don't wait for me to talk about it, because I won't be talking about the amount of potential land that may be needed for industrial. I'm specifically going to be talking about potential areas. And the reason for that is that regardless of whether we would need 1 acre or 100 acres for industrial land, or 1,000 or 1,000,000, we would have to do this analysis. So we're doing that due diligence and looking at the lands outside the UGB, regardless of what any potential expansion amount may be. So that keep that in mind as we walk through this information. So I'll update you on some of the mapping and data that we've continued to do and what we're learning about these areas, and I'll also update you on our contacts with property owners in these various areas. So by point of summary, you've seen this map before. Essentially, all of the areas in kind of this brownish color outside the UGB are already off the table in terms of being considered for industrial lands, either because they are Class 1 soils, they are residential lands, they are wetlands, they are steep slopes. All of those factors, or the parcel sizes are smaller than are needed for industrial, all of those factors have ruled out most of those areas. So what we're left with are really these 4 areas: Clear Lake, Coburg Game Farm, Russell Creek Basin where LCC is, and Goshen. First off, want to note that the Goshen area, almost everyone that we have spoken with, and Lane County has spoken with pretty much everyone in the state, agree that Goshen is a prime area for industrial use, more intensive industrial use in the future. Its position along I-5 and Highway 58, and the fact that you have existing industrial use there presents a lot of great opportunities for industries that need that I-5 access. For that reason, Lane County staff are already looking at intensifying use in the Goshen area. They are contacting property owners who own that land and also adjacent property owners. And so, as is currently the case in our proposal in the pillar document, we maintain our support of Lane County's efforts to intensify that use in Goshen as an area that would remain outside of Eugene's urban growth. So that's an update on where things are with Goshen. In terms of the Russell Creek area, I'll talk quickly about that. This does not show up well here, but I'll kind of talk you through this. The initial study area here, shown in red, is about 550 acres. And this is 30th here, here's I-5, here's LCC. In looking at this area, there are several constraints to industrial use here. One is the property owned by LCC here, 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 and here. All areas that they do not foresee an industrial use on in the future. You have the Oak Hill School here. You have a property here privately owned that has fairly steep slopes on it. And then you have a collection of properties here on the north side that when you get up in here you have steeper slopes, but in here you have a lot of very small residential parcels. They are viable for industrial use because of their proximity to I-5, but because of the need to assemble all of those small parcels and have the current homeowners move out, it seems to pose some significant limitations to industrial use. So it doesn't take it off the table, but that issue is there. So what you really are left with are essentially 2 properties. Here you have 2 tax lots that total 18 acres, and here a 50-acre parcel. So we sent letters to both of those landowners. We've heard back from this one. They do have an interest in potentially having this area be inside the UGB for industrial use. We have not heard back from this property owner. However, we do know that this property has extensive wetlands on it that have been a barrier to development in the past. So it may not be the most viable site. So while this area remains an area for consideration, you can see there are some limitations on what could happen here from an industrial standpoint.
Just for a point of reference, can you show where the old landfill is up there?
I actually don't know, to be honest with you. If anybody knows.
It's to the left.
Oh, it's further to the left. Okay, it's off the screen.
Okay.
The interchange is right here, so I guess it's up this way.
Thank you.
And so our attention then turns to the 2 areas that have kind of risen to the top, and one of the reasons is their proximity to the UGB. They are both currently proximate, while the Russell Creek area is already kind of removed from the UGB. These areas are adjacent to our UGB. So the first area we'll talk about is Clear Lake. Initially we were looking at an 850-acre study area for potential. The area shown in red here is about 640 acres, encompasses the 20 property owners that we sent letters to. For reference here, here is the airport, one of the airport runways. Here is Highway 99. And then our urban growth boundary runs right along here. So we have a lot of industrial use already right here, and we have the airport use here. What's shown in here, what's shown on the map in green are Class 1 and Class 2 agricultural soils. The Class 1 soils, a little hard to see, are these darker green. So we've got some patches here. And the Class 2 are this light green. And these are Class 2 up here as well. Class 1 soils are listed as having slightly, I can't remember the terminology. Anyway, that they need very little modification to be suitable for agriculture. Class 2 soils are considered moderately limited for agriculture. Both Class 1 and Class 2 are classified by state statute as being high-value agricultural soils. And what statute directs us to do is to look to all other areas first before those areas. The only reason we're showing any areas, in interest in any areas that have Class 1 or Class 2 soils, is that we have already looked at all the other areas, and there really aren't any other areas left. There is precedent in other cities that are surrounded by Class 1 and Class 2 soils that they have nowhere else to grow, and so they do end up growing on those soils. So it can be done, you just simply have to look everywhere else first. So based on this information, and we contacted these property owners, we have heard back from 14 property owners, shown in the yellow stars with the red outline, these here. And these 14 owners represent 522 of the acres, so a significant portion. All of those property owners have shown an interest in being included in the urban growth boundary for industrial use. Almost all of these property owners acquired their property through having it passed down to them. They are absentee landowners. Typically, they don't live on the property, and they are doing some relatively low value farming, whether it be grass seed or hay. Almost all of them are reporting that what they're generating off the property is about enough to cover the taxes. So they aren't pursuing any productive agricultural use there. Doesn't mean it can't happen there, just means that's how they're using it right now. And there are a couple landowners here we haven't heard back from, and we're going to continue our attempts to hear from them.
The blue stars, Jason?
Yes, the blue stars we haven't heard from, so this property and then these two right here. So one of the things we heard early on was we need to examine what the wetland issues may be out here. We don't want to have areas inside of our urban growth boundary that have the same wetland issues as some of our vacant industrial land inside. And so we had an off-site study done. You've seen this map before. It was based on old aerial photos, current aerial photos, and soils maps, mapping pretty much what would be the greatest possible extent of wetlands. The update that I have for you here, and so those areas are shown in green. We're calling them potential wetlands. What's important here is that if you have an area that has extensive wetlands, they would need to be mitigated to be developed, and the cost of mitigation can be high, so it could prevent an area from developing. We've been working more with property owners. We have several who are interested in allowing on-site survey to see what wetlands may be there. We have one property that had a wetland study done in the past. We're showing about 45 acres of potential wetlands here. Their study, which was approved by the state, showed that there were about 3 acres of wetlands on this site. So it shows you that off-site mapping doesn't get you what you need. You really need to get out there, kick the dirt, dig a few holes, see what's there. So it's a good reminder that we are mapping probably the greatest extent of wetlands here, and it's likely, I would say, based on that property, that once we get out there, some of these have fewer wetlands than what are shown here. So we're continuing that work with property owners on that issue. I want to quickly take you on a little visual tour of this area. If you haven't been out here, it's been a while, get a sense for what it looks like. Down here you'll see this dot. This is where the photo is taken from, looking to the northeast. So you can see here's the vacant land right here, or the land that's outside, and you're looking towards the existing industrial use here along Highway 99. This next site a little further down Clear Lake Road, again just showing these parcels and the existing industrial use that is right here. And again, the UGB is right there. Another view of that area. It was a cloudy day. These don't show that well. This one is up here on Airport Road, looking southeast. What you can see here, this industrial use, are the properties that are right here. So many of these sites are already adjacent to existing industrial uses. Up here off of Green Hill Road, looking to the southeast, you can see the industrial along Highway 99. It is right in here. And if you're standing on Highway 99 looking across this property, you can see the airport right here. So that's just a quick look at what some of those areas look like. So shifting over to the Coburg Game Farm area, we have some additional work that we've done here as well. The initial study area here shown in red is about 350 acres. This is I-5. This is Game Farm Road. Here's Coburg Road. And the UGB is right here. So as you can see, most of this area is Class 1 and Class 2 soils. Class 1 soils are right here. And then all of the rest of this is Class 2. So a significant amount of those high-value soils in this area. Some things that are kind of advantageous for this site are its proximity to I-5 and the fact that Springfield has existing industrial uses over here. Here's the Royal Caribbean building. Springfield is also examining this area for potential expansion for industrial uses. Their work there is ongoing. So what we did was look at any of the parcels in this area that were greater than 30 acres in size, or greater than 20 acres in size. And so we sent letters to those owners. There were 5. There are some owners who own multiple properties, so that's why there are more than 5 stars here. We've heard back from 2 of these owners. This property actually has 5 separate owners, again, passed down to heirs in the family. We've met with 3 of those owners who are supportive, and we will be meeting soon with the other 2. And then 1 property owner who has 4 properties here, totaling more than 30 acres, also is supportive of being in the UGB for industrial use. The other ones we have not heard from at this point. We're going to continue following up with those property owners to hear from them. Use of these properties is very similar to the uses out on Clear Lake Road. You've got properties passed down to generation, not actively they aren't really farmers, they aren't used to farming, they're basically leasing it out for grass seed or for hay, and again, kind of about enough to cover the taxes. Again, a quick tour here. Here's where we're standing on Game Farm Road looking towards I-5. Gives you a sense there of the proximity to I-5 of this site. Moving up the road again, looking back down to the southeast, you can see the Royal Caribbean building right here. A little further up Armitage Road, which runs right here. This is looking to the northeast across this property. And then another one of the vacant properties looking to the southwest here. So that's kind of a quick tour of the work that we've been doing. We are hoping to hear more from more property owners, but there's been significant interest. Essentially, every property owner who has responded to the letter has shown an interest in being in the UGB for industrial. Many of them have said, we had hoped this had happened a long time ago, we had thought that it would, and that may be guiding some of their management decisions. That they are holding on to the land, not investing in it significantly, would be one reason why we're not seeing more intensive use there. We'll continue our work on the wetlands issues in Clear Lake to try to get out on the ground, see if we can determine what's really there. Again, following up with those owners in Game Farm. And then as we start talking about what specific industries we might be targeting, that may guide our work a little more on what sites work better. For example, a site near I-5 might work better for some industries than a site near the airport would, and vice versa. So that may refine areas we look at as well. That's it. But when I did have a map that I want to show you real quick of the Junction City UGB relative to the Eugene UGB. With all due respect to Councilor Farr's arm strength, it's about 4,000 feet, so maybe you should be playing in right field.
We should call Sarah then.
But it is fairly close. There is just one property between. It's owned by MWMC. It's a continuation of the property.
Now, where is the airport on that?
The airport is
Over here.
right in here.
And that's inside the city limits.
It is not. It's outside the UGB, outside the city limits.
It's in Ward 6, though.
Oh, yes.
The little pieces of it.
So that's it.
Thank you.
So, a question regarding that, it's outside the city limits. How come we have voters that live out there then?
Yes.
In the queue.
In that section that's out in the northwest.
The little pink section up there that says Ward 6.
Right. Those are industrial uses that are, to be relatively recent uses that were annexed.
There are 23 voters out there
Yeah.
who vote in Ward 6, so therefore they live in the city limits. And if I stand on their property, that's where I can reach with a rock, not down here.
Good to have that clarification.
Yeah.
It is the city limits. I mean, there are voters.
George,
How many acres are potentially industrial in Goshen?
That area, I believe, is around, I want to say 200 acres, 250 acres, I think. There's potential there.
And approximately how many owners?
There are, I think, 5 or 6 large owners and a series of smaller owners. So you have some relatively large parcels there.
And are there any EPA concerns or, cleanup, or are any of them toxic sites?
As far as I know, none of them are recorded as official toxic sites. There certainly may be, a lot of sites. Until you redevelop them, you often don't know what's there. But as far as I know, there aren't any.
And does that help us, though? So we really can't expand our urban growth boundary into Goshen. Does that help us with our requirements to this for having industrial land available? That's not
All
inside
eyes
the
are
city limits?
pointing to me.
And the microphone. You know, it's something that we need to keep our eye on. Technically, for us to be able to count it towards our identified need, we would either need to be able to bring it in the UGB, which we can't because of its location, or we would need to actually do some formal regional planning. And my understanding is, while there's a lot of discussion around Goshen and that there's definitely an intent to do some regional planning, I don't know that it's clear which jurisdictions would be involved, and that a formal regional planning process has not yet begun. So for purposes of what you're doing now, no. But, you know, when we have questions like this, I always think of that last pillar, the seventh pillar, which is the ability to be flexible and keep your eye on these things. And, you know, if in fact in the next 20 years, and I hope it's certainly with a lot sooner than that, there is some regional planning that happens, we may be able to make some adjustments. And that land may become our short-term available industrial land for our region that we kind of transfer our efforts to. But at this point, no.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Yeah, that's kind of the shame of not looking at this whole thing regionally and having to just look at Eugene only. It's kind of silly because it's just a stone's throw from the LCC area and that basin there, and so yeah, another stone throwing.
Within 4,000 feet.
You lost 4,000 feet.
That is inside the
That's not the definition of a stone's throw, is it? 4,000 feet.
rocket-propelled stone.
Right. You lost out on the metaphor today, Chris.
Does anyone else want to ask a question or speak?
No, thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And is that all?
That's it for today. Thank you very much.
Okay. Meeting is over.
Thank you.
So Jason.